Every god who ever claimed power over death was eventually forgotten. His temples fell, his priests died, his name dissolved into the air like smoke from a cold altar. Every god, that is, except one. Because the one who actually governs death was never worshipped out of love. He was never painted in gold on a temple ceiling, never celebrated with wine and music and dance. He was spoken of in whispers, approached only through averted eyes and the trembling of a blade above a pit dug in black earth. And here is the thing that should unsettle you. He didn't need your worship. He didn't need your recognition. He possessed the one leverage that no Olympian, no mortal hero, no philosopher with clever arguments about the soul could ever neutralize. Mathematical certainty. He already owned you. He was simply waiting for delivery. His name, in the oldest form, meant the unseen one. And the Greeks, who understood more about death than most civilizations have dared to admit, decided the worst thing you could do was say it out loud. Before there was theology, before there was philosophy, before Plato invented a paradise and Paul promised a resurrection, there was a Greek understanding of death so cold and so mechanistic that 2,500 years of cultural revision have barely managed to bury it. The Homeric cosmos did not divide the universe into good and evil. It divided it into jurisdictions. And the jurisdiction that swallowed everything, the jurisdiction that never lost a case, belonged to the god the Greeks were too afraid to name. We have spent centuries building a comfortable lie about the ancient Greek underworld. We have lined it with fire, populated it with demons, installed a villain who plots his escape from his subterranean prison. We have done this because the truth is infinitely more disturbing. The truth is that the Lord of the Dead is not your enemy. He is not cruel. He does not hate you. He simply administers a system with the cold efficiency of a machine that has never malfunctioned, never been overridden, and never once expressed a preference for any particular outcome. And what that machine does to you is worse than anything a devil could design. To understand him, you have to begin at the moment the universe was legally divided. In the echo of a war that shook creation. The Titanomachy lasted a decade, 10 years of catastrophic violence between the old gods, the Titans who governed the cosmos under Kronos, and the young Olympians who had survived their father's paranoid hunger. The war is described in Hesiod's Theogony with an almost geological sense of trauma. Mountains uprooted, seas boiling, the earth groaning under impacts that left scars still visible in the bedrock. When it ended, when Kronos fell and the Titans were hurled into the deepest chamber of creation, 3 brothers divided the universe between them. And the mechanism of that division is the most important detail that modern culture has completely erased. It was a lottery, not a reward, not a punishment, not a judgment of character. The original Greek text uses the phrase triktha de panta dedastai. All was divided 3 ways, and the mechanism was palos, the shaking of lots. Zeus shook a container. 3 cosmic lots tumbled out. Somebody drew the sky, somebody drew the sea, and one of the brothers drew the lot of the mists and the dense darkness. That brother was not exiled. He had not sinned. He had not rebelled. He had won 1/3 of everything. The Greeks understood this absolutely, and Poseidon makes it explicit in the Iliad when he refuses Zeus's attempt at total dominion, citing the cosmic treaty that the lottery established. Earth and high Olympus are common to all 3, he insists. They are co-equal sovereigns. Their jurisdictions simply do not overlap. This is the detail that 20 centuries of Abrahamic theology scraped away and replaced with a devil. Because a neutral administrator is far more terrifying than a villain. You can reason with a villain. You can pray for a villain's change of heart. You cannot petition a bureaucrat who simply executes a system that was designed before you were born. And that is precisely what the Lord of the Dead is. He did not choose this, he was assigned it, and he performs his function with a flawlessness that should make every living creature on earth profoundly uncomfortable. His name, the real one, the Homeric one, is Aides. Philologists trace it to the Proto-Indo-European root that gives us, in its negated form, the unseen one, the invisible one. This is not a metaphor for mystery. This is the literal architecture of the Greek conceptualization of death. He is not a fire you can see coming. He is the absence of sight itself. His famous helmet, the cap of Hades, forged by the Cyclopes during the war against the Titans, renders its wearer completely imperceptible to every form of detection. The gods used it as a weapon. He wears it as an administrative tool. He moves through the cosmos without being seen or felt or anticipated, and one day he touches you, and your allotted time, your Moira, is simply complete. There is no malice in this. There is no hatred. Hesiod describes him as pitiless in heart, but the Greek word for pitiless here does not carry the weight of cruelty. It carries the weight of the clinician. The coroner who has signed 10,000 death certificates does not weep over number 10,001. Not because he is a monster, because he is performing a function that the system requires, and sentimentality would make the system fail. And the system cannot fail. That is the point. That has always been the point. He governs under the formal administrative title Anax Eneroi, King of those below. Not king of the wicked, not king of the punished, king of those below. All of them, unconditionally. Every soul that has ever drawn a last breath since the world began. He processes incoming arrivals, not personally, but through a tribunal of 3 former mortal kings, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who sit upon the plane of judgment with golden scepters and an urn, mechanically sorting the endless tide of the deceased into their respective holding zones. He maintains his own infrastructure, his own herdsman, the demon Menoetes, who grazes his immortal black cattle across the dark plains of the underworld. It is an estate, fully self-sustaining, an estate that needs nothing from you, wants nothing from you, and will eventually absorb you whether you cooperate or resist. The Olympian gods need worship to sustain their power. They conduct affairs with mortals, meddle in wars, make bargains, accept bribes of incense and slaughtered animals. Their power is relational. It depends on a reciprocity between the divine and the human. He has no such dependency. He does not need temples. He does not need priests. He does not need your prayers. He is the only god in the Greek pantheon who actually performs his function with total, unbroken consistency, day after day, age after age, without a single vacation to Olympus, without a single amorous adventure on the surface world, without a single act of vanity or ego or weakness. He is, by every metric, the most competent god in the Greek cosmos. And the Greeks were absolutely, completely, existentially terrified of him. The terror did not come from cruelty. It came from something far worse. It came from the recognition that Hades represented the part of reality that no amount of heroism, cleverness, wealth, or divine favor could defer forever. The Olympians might be bribed, or tricked, or seduced. Fate could occasionally be nudged by the right combination of sacrifice and cunning. But eventually, the gate fastener, the one whose epithet is Pylartes, would receive his delivery. And the gates of his kingdom, as the Greeks noted with particular dread, opened only in one direction. They opened inward. Which means what entered could not leave. Not because it lacked strength, because the architecture itself was built that way. The gate fastener does not bolt the door. The door simply has no handle on the inside. But the terror of the gate is nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what waits behind it. Because the true horror of the Greek underworld is not what it does to the wicked, it is what it does to everyone else. And that story begins with a word the Greeks couldn't say without feeling the cold move through them. A word we'll have to confront in full to understand why the most powerful warrior who ever lived, a man who chose death over obscurity, ended up begging for a chance to be a slave. There is a specific kind of fear that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with heat or sound. It arrives as a slow, peripheral wrongness, the way a room feels occupied before you see anyone in it, the way a body knows something has changed before the mind finds language for it. The ancient Greeks lived inside that feeling every time they thought too long about the god whose name they almost never said. And the way they avoided saying it tells you more about the architecture of human terror than anything written in a modern psychology textbook. The name Hades had a quality that the ancient world recognized as sympathetically dangerous. Names, in the archaic Greek understanding, were not arbitrary labels. They were acoustic keys to a divine attention. To speak the name of a god was to pull their gaze, and to pull the gaze of the unseen one was to suggest, at some resonant frequency the universe could hear, that you were ready to be seen by him too. So the Greeks, across 2,000 years of documented history, developed an entire parallel lexicon of avoidance. Not one substitute, not a polite euphemism, but a sophisticated linguistic immune system built around the one name no one wanted to say. The most prominent substitute was Pluton, the wealthy one. There is a tragic ingenuity in this choice. The Greeks reasoned, with the desperate creativity of people trying to rationalize the irrational, that since the dead are buried in the earth, and since the earth is also the source of crops and minerals and everything that sustains life, the Lord of the dead must also be the Lord of underground abundance. So they renamed the administrator of the abyss as a kind of generous banker. They called the mouth of the grave a treasure chest. The tragic playwright Sophocles, who had no patience for comfortable lies, observed the irony with clinical precision. The gloomy one, he noted, enriches himself with our sighs and our tears. The renaming was not cynical. It was an act of collective therapy, an entire civilization trying to metabolize an unbearable truth by coating it in something that felt manageable. Call him the wealthy one, the good counselor, the host of many, the renowned one. Dress the void in the language of hospitality and wisdom. Make the grave sound like a prosperous estate with a waiting list. The alternative, sitting with the unadorned reality of permanent, indiscriminate, mechanistic erasure, was not survivable at the level of daily consciousness. And yet the real adjectives kept surfacing. Homer, in the 9th book of the Iliad, strips the diplomatic coding entirely and delivers the bare assessment of the archaic Greek psyche. Aedes gives not way, and is pitiless, and therefore he among all the gods is most hateful to mortals. Most hateful. Not most frightening, not most powerful, but most hateful. Because he is the only one who will not negotiate, cannot be seduced, and does not care about the outcome of any transaction you try to initiate with him. The linguistic terror did not remain abstract. It became embodied in ritual. Ancient Greek religious practice was divided into two fundamental categories, as different from each other as surgery is from celebration. The Olympian rites, the Uranic traditions, were acts of joyful communion. A raised altar, prayers directed upward to the open sky, the smell of roasting meat rising with the smoke, the community gathering around the sacrifice to share the feast with the god. The underlying transaction was one of reciprocal affection. Here is our gratitude. Here is our offering. Here is the smoke carrying our love upward to where you live. These were the rituals of relationship. The chthonic rites were the exact inversion of every element of that paradigm. To sacrifice to Hades was not to seek communion. It was to perform an act of desperate avoidance. The worshipper did not approach a raised altar. They dug a pit. A bothros, a hole cut into the dark earth, into which the offerings would descend rather than rise. The ritual was called the enagismos, and it was performed in an atmosphere of grief and fear so thick it had its own acoustic signature. The animal selected for the sacrifice had to be black, a black ram, a black pig, a creature whose color matched the destination of the offering. Its throat was cut over the pit, head forced downward, so the black blood drained entirely into the earth. There was no communal feast. You did not consume the food of the dead. To eat the meat after a chthonic sacrifice was to tether yourself, in some cosmic biological sense, to the realm you were trying to appease. The entire animal was burned or buried. And then there was the matter of the eyes. Ritual protocol required the worshippers to avert their gaze during the sacrifice. A literal, physical refusal to make visual contact with the act they were performing. The Greek mind understood that the moment of chthonic sacrifice was a moment of dangerous proximity to the unseen one, and the only safe posture was to look away, to perform the offering with your face turned from the pit, your eyes fixed on the bright sky above, as a reminder that you were still among the living. When even that failed, when the terror had to be pushed all the way down into the earth itself, the Greeks beat the ground with their bare hands. This is not metaphor. This is documented in the Iliad. When Althea calls down a curse on her son Meleager, she falls to her knees and strikes the earth, many times, with her bare hands, beating the dirt repeatedly while calling on Aedes and the terrifying queen of the underworld to hear her. The percussive impact of flesh against soil was the archaic telephone, the acoustics of the abyss. You could not email the bureaucracy of death. You had to knock on the floor. There is something in this image. A grown woman alone on the ground, hammering the earth with her fists, face twisted with grief and fury, that cuts through 3,000 years of temporal distance and lands with absolute clarity. Every human culture has had its version of this gesture, the fist against the ground, the voice directed downward, the acknowledgement, finally stripped of all the polite euphemisms, that there is something below us that hears, that operates, that does not care about the quality of your life, or the warmth of your character, or the number of years you feel you still deserve. It receives, it files, it retains. And what it does to what it receives is the most devastating revelation of all. Because the Greeks had looked carefully, in their honest, clear-eyed way, at what death actually does to a human being. Not what theology promises it does, not what comfort requires us to believe it does, what it actually, materially does. And they built an underworld that reflected that observation with brutal fidelity. It does not punish you. It does not reward you. It does not evaluate your legacy or weigh your contributions or measure the love you left behind. It reduces you, uniformly, inexorably. Without appeal, it reduces every human consciousness, no matter how vast, to the same thin, flickering residue. And the architecture of that reduction, the specific geography of erasure, is what you need to understand before you can feel the full weight of what a dead warrior named Achilles said to a living man on the wrong side of the pit. Forget the fire. Every instinct your culture has installed about the underworld is pointing in the wrong direction. The Greek abyss is not hot. It is not loud. It is not populated by demons with instruments of torture, and there is no throne room villain plotting his escape from a prison of flames. The Greek abyss is cold. It is gray. It is so breathtakingly, suffocatingly quiet that the loudest sound you can identify, once your ears adjust, is the thin, insect-like chirping of billions of identical shadows moving through ash-colored weeds in a twilight that has never once, in the entire history of the cosmos, been interrupted by sunlight. This is infinitely worse than fire. Fire at least implies that someone cares enough to punish you. Fire means your crimes were recorded, evaluated, and sentenced. Fire means you were seen as an individual, a specific moral account that required specific moral balancing. The Homeric underworld does not offer you that dignity. Its horror is purely passive. It does not target you. It absorbs you, the way a sponge absorbs water, without preference, without recognition, without any structural awareness that you were ever anything other than one more unit of biological material completing its inevitable transition from the organized to the dispersed. The topography of this erasure is built from 4 primary zones, and understanding their function is understanding the actual psychology of ancient Greek dread. The entrance is governed by the gate fastener's architecture of absolute containment. The multi-headed hound Cerberus does not prevent entry, he prevents exit. His function is asymmetric. He welcomes every arrival with 3 mouths that do not bite an incoming soul, because incoming souls are expected traffic. He turns those same mouths on anything that attempts to leave, because nothing is authorized to leave. He is the ultimate one-way valve in a system designed around the principle of permanent retention. Beyond him, the doorkeeper Iacchus checks the paperwork. Inside, the tribunal of 3 exhausted civil servants, former mortal kings, now permanent employees of the abyss, sit with their golden scepters and their sorting urn and mechanically process the incoming tide. There is no queue jumping. There is no appeals process. The urn turns, the lot falls, and you are directed to your permanent zone. For most of you, that zone is the Asphodel Meadows. Post-classical romantics occasionally described the Asphodel Meadows as a pleasant neutral ground, a kind of spiritual waiting room that was at least preferable to active torment. This is the kind of revision that only happens when you stop looking at the source material. The asphodel plant is a pale, grayish, spiky weed. It grows on desolate, exhausted soil. It produces a disagreeable odor. In the ancient world, it was planted near graves because it was believed to nourish the dead. But its visual association was always with ash, with decay, with the bleached-out remains of things that had once been living. To wander the Asphodel Meadows is not to rest in a pleasant field. It is to drift through an endless gray waste of pale weeds that smell faintly of the grave, in a twilight that never brightens, among millions of others doing exactly the same thing. And you are doing it without your mind. The dead in Homer are called skiai, shadows or shades. This translation is slightly too generous. They are closer to two-dimensional impressions, weightless, semi-transparent imprints of the biological host they once inhabited. They have been stripped of their phrenes, the Greek word that encompasses the intellect, the mind, the center of cognitive function. They are not thinking. They are not remembering. They are emitting a thin, automatic residue of the self that once existed, like the last heat radiating from a stone after the fire goes out. The mechanism by which this cognitive stripping is achieved is the River Lethe. The word Lethe literally translates to forgetting or oblivion. Its etymological relationship to the Greek word for truth, aletheia, which means, literally, the unforgotten, the unconcealed, is not accidental. Truth, in the Greek understanding, is the act of pulling something out of concealment. Lethe is the act of pushing everything back in. Permanently. The dead are required to drink from this river, and the drinking dissolves the ego entirely, erasing memories, severing the threads that connect the self to every person, every place, every moment that made the self what it was. Plato described the region in the Republic as the plain of Lethe, through which the river of unmindfulness flows. It is the ultimate sanitization protocol before permanent archival storage. The filing system of the dead has no need for the actual contents of a human life. It retains the unit. It discards everything the unit believed made it irreplaceable. And then there are the edge cases. The individuals whose crimes were not against morality, but against the mechanism itself. Sisyphus pushed his boulder up the hill before it rolled back down, not because he was excessively ambitious or cunning. He pushed it because he twice broke the system. He chained Thanatos, the personification of death, to a wall, stopping the flow of souls into the underworld entirely, and leaving the world of the living in the bizarre situation of having no one die, the wounded lying in agony that could not resolve, the old surviving past every natural endpoint. And then, even after being captured and brought below, he convinced Persephone to allow him to return to the surface on a technicality. He came back. He lived on. He gamed the bureaucracy. The response was not rage. It was architecture. The physics of the boulder are not punishment in the emotional sense. They are a containment loop, a closed system that absorbs all of his energy and returns nothing. He cannot escape because every iteration of the cycle consumes the capacity he would need to attempt escape. The underworld patched the vulnerability by binding the hacker inside an infinite loop that keeps him too occupied to threaten the system again. Tantalus receives the same treatment. He tested the boundary between mortal mortality and divine immortality by serving his son's flesh to the gods, attempting to prove they were not omniscient. The response is a physics glitch of receding water and rising fruit, a sensory experience that loops forever without resolution, tethering him to a consumption impulse he can never satisfy. Not torture. Administration. An account flagged for permanent quarantine. Pirithous, who attempted to abduct the queen herself, finds himself fused to the chair of forgetfulness, molecularly bonded to the furniture of the underworld, no longer a person with agency, but a permanent fixture of the infrastructure. He became part of the building. It is the most total administrative response possible. You tried to disrupt the system, so you have been incorporated into the system. You are now, effectively, part of the wall. This is the immune system of death. When the bureaucracy is threatened, it does not deploy emotion. It deploys geometry. But all of this, the gray meadows, the cognitive erasure, the looping punishments, these are the secondary features of the machine. The primary feature, the one that collapses everything you thought you understood about what made a life worth living, reveals itself not in a geographic description, but in a conversation. A conversation between a living man standing at the edge of a pit and the most decorated ghost in the history of the Greek cosmos. The ghost's name was Achilles, and what he said should have ended the entire culture of heroic glory right there. That it didn't, that human beings heard it and still chose the sword and the siege and the burning city, tells you something about the limits of even the most devastating honesty. There is a woman at the center of this story who has been misread for 2,000 years, and the misreading is not accidental. It serves a purpose. It makes the myth manageable. It converts a narrative about cold geopolitical violence and the terrifying metamorphosis of trauma into something that can be shelved between a fairy tale and a romance novel. It gives modern audiences a victim, a villain, and a resolution. The actual story contains none of those things. It contains something considerably more unsettling. A young woman who descends into the worst place imaginable and emerges as the single most feared figure in the entire underworld. More feared than her husband, more feared than the gate, more feared than the river of forgetting. And it was her father who sent her there. The abduction of Persephone is, in the oldest available texts, a contract rather than a crime. The Homeric hymn to Demeter, the 6th century text that represents the most authoritative version of the myth, does not bury the architect of the event. It names him in the 2nd line of the relevant passage. Zeus, wise in counsel, gave her away. The verb is critical. While Hades performs the physical act of harpazein, to seize or snatch, it is Zeus's act of dokein, to give, that makes the union legally binding within the Greek cultural framework. In ancient Athenian law, the transfer of a woman from her father's household to her husband's was called ekdosis, the giving away. A woman possessed no legal standing in this transaction. Her kyrios, her male legal guardian, held absolute authority to arrange the terms. The violence of Hades' arrival in the meadow, the black horses surging from the split earth, the ground closing over the girl's screams. This was not a rogue act of divine criminality. It was the cosmic, physical manifestation of a standard patriarchal legal procedure, authorized at the highest possible administrative level, executed with the urgency of a sovereign who required a politically advantageous alliance, and had found the most efficient mechanism available for creating one. Demeter's grief was not legally recognized. Persephone's consent was not legally required. Zeus had issued the contract. Hades had executed the delivery. The transaction was complete. But the transaction had consequences that no one, perhaps not even Zeus, fully anticipated. Because what happened to Persephone in the underworld was not what happens to a victim. What happened to Persephone was a metamorphosis. The cultic evidence, particularly from the Orphic tradition and from the archaeological record of southern Italy, where Greek colonists maintained some of the most intense chthonic religious practices in the ancient world, reveals a figure who bears almost no resemblance to the weeping maiden of the meadow. The curse tablets, the deficciones, small strips of lead etched with malice and buried in graves and wells across the Mediterranean world for centuries, constitute the lived, daily, practical religion of people who needed real results from the underworld. And those tablets almost never invoke the husband. They invoke the wife. They invoke her as Despoina, the mistress. They invoke her as Epain Persephonea, dread Persephone, using an adjective that denotes not mere fear, but the specific, paralyzing, bodily awe inspired by a force that has moved beyond the reach of any negotiation. The Orphic hymns address her as the subterranean queen who commands the gates of Hades, who is the literal mother of the Erinnues, the Furies, those bloodhounds of karmic retribution who pursue the guilty across the surface of the living world and into the corridors of the dead. Orphic hymn 29 gives her the epithet Praxidike, the exactor of justice. And it concludes with a line that distills her dual nature with devastating precision. You alone are life and death. To toiling mortals, Persephone, you nourish all, always. And kill them too. Not her husband. Her. The Orphic gold tablets, small strips of gold foil buried with initiated mystery cult members to serve as instructions for navigating the afterlife, contain explicit passwords and pleas directed entirely to her. The initiate must approach and announce, I am the child of earth and starry heaven, hoping that this genealogical password will convince her to grant a different kind of passage than the standard processing through the Asphodel field and the river of forgetting. She, not Hades, holds the bureaucratic stamp of salvation or permanent erasure. He is the building. She is the will that animates it. Think about what this metamorphosis actually means. A young woman is torn from the living world by an act of institutional violence that her father authorized and her mother could not prevent. She descends into the coldest, most terminal jurisdiction in existence. She consumes the pomegranate seed, 6 seeds in most versions, and in the ancient biological and legal understanding of that act, consumption of the food of the dead integrates the physical matter of the underworld into the biological host. It is not a trick by a manipulative captor. It is the execution of a binding cosmic contract. The pomegranate tethers her to the underworld at the molecular level, altering her jurisdictional allegiance, ensuring that she is now of that realm in a way that cannot be undone by the grief of a mother or the diplomacy of Hermes. And then she rules it, not as a prisoner ruling her cell, as a sovereign who has discovered a jurisdiction where her authority is absolute and her power is unconstrained by the politics of Olympus. Her husband sits in the vast, silent infrastructure of the kingdom, the immovable anvil of cosmic order. She becomes the descending hammer. She is the one who hears the curses tapped into lead tablets and buried in the ground. She is the one who dispatches the Furies. She is the one who holds the initiate's passwords and decides whether to grant exceptional passage or route them into the standard processing queue. The most terrifying aspect of the Persephone narrative, the part that the pop cultural adaptations invariably sand down until it's smooth and comfortable, is not the abduction. The abduction is something that happened to her. The terrifying part is who she became after. Because she became the only figure in the Greek cosmos who operates with the full authority of the underworld and the full intelligence of someone who remembers the surface world. She knows what life feels like. She chose, through the act of eating, to permanently tether herself to its antithesis. And that combination, the memory of warmth married to the absolute authority of the cold, makes her infinitely more dangerous than a god who never knew sunlight at all. She returns to the surface for a portion of each year, carrying the memory of gray weeds and frozen rivers up into the growing light, watching the flowers bloom around her feet, while somewhere in the back of her mind the lead tablets pile up, and the Furies wait, and the river of forgetting turns. She is the reason the Greeks understood that winter is not merely the absence of summer, it is the presence of something else entirely. Something that was always there, underneath, patient and jurisdictional, waiting for the girl to come home. But even the Dread Queen exists within a system larger than herself, and to understand the true scale of what that system dismantles, you need to understand the one thing that ancient Greek heroes believed made them immortal. Not a divine parent, not a magic weapon, a word. A concept so central to the aristocratic Greek psyche that men walked into certain death to protect it. And then you need to hear what the greatest of those men, standing in the gray meadow, stripped of his armor and his future and his voice, said about what that word was actually worth. The ancient Greek hero was running from something. This is the detail the epics want you to feel in your sternum rather than understand in your mind. Every charge across the blood-soaked field, every duel called out before the assembled armies, every meticulously maintained genealogy of divine parentage and battlefield kill counts, these were not the expressions of men who loved violence. They were the desperate productivity of men who had looked clearly at what waited for them at the end, and decided that the only rational response was to burn so brightly in the interim that the dark could not fully swallow them. The concept was called Kleos, immortal glory, the resonance of your name in the songs of living people long after your body had returned to earth. The Greeks did not believe in a universal paradise. The Elysian fields existed for the exceptional few, the direct descendants of gods, the singularly beloved of Olympus, and even then, the texts are ambiguous about what exactly happened there, beyond a kind of pleasant stasis. For the vast majority of human beings, the afterlife was the asphodel field, the gray weeds, the stripped mind, the river of forgetting. And so the only mechanism of immortality available to an ordinary human being, or even an extraordinary one, was linguistic. You had to make your name survive the rot of your body. You had to ensure that the songs about what you did outlasted the physical evidence that you had ever existed. This is why Achilles chose the short life with glory over the long life in obscurity. Not because he was suicidal or reckless or didn't understand the stakes. Because he had run the calculation and determined that a long life of anonymity, ending in the asphodel field alongside everyone else, was meaningfully identical to a short life of glory, ending in the asphodel field alongside everyone else. Except that the short, glorious life produced Kleos, and the long, anonymous life produced nothing that survived the river of forgetting. He had made the rational choice, and then he died at Troy. And then Odysseus came to the edge of the pit. The Nekyia, Book 11 of the Odyssey, is the most uncomfortable chapter in Homeric literature, and it is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses to comfort you. Odysseus pours the black blood into the Bothros, the shallow pit dug in the dark earth at the edge of the world, and the dead come clustering. He holds them back with his sword, allowing only those he needs to drink and speak. And among those who approach, moving through the gray meadow with the pale asphodel plants shivering around his ankles, is the shade of Achilles, the greatest warrior in the Greek tradition, the man who embodied the heroic ideal so completely that his choice at the crossroads between glory and longevity became the defining parable of the entire cultural system. The man whose Kleos was so vast that 2,500 years later, in a world that no longer speaks his language or worships his gods, his name is still immediately recognizable to any reasonably educated person on Earth. Odysseus, trying to be kind, tries to console him. He reminds Achilles of his enormous renown among the living. He suggests that Achilles must command the underworld the way he commanded armies, with authority and respect, and the recognition of his exceptional status. What Achilles says in response is the single most devastating thing in the Homeric corpus. He says he would rather be a living slave, a landless thrall working someone else's field for someone else's benefit, with nothing and no prospects, than be king over all the perished dead. Read that slowly. The greatest hero in Greek mythology is telling you that his Kleos, the thing he died to achieve, the immortal glory that he chose over decades of life, is worth less to him than the most degraded form of living existence available in the ancient world. He is not being metaphorical. He is reporting from experience. He is telling you what it actually feels like, from inside the gray meadow, to have made the calculation and discovered that the variable you were betting on, the value of posthumous renown, does not survive the crossing. Because here is what Kleos actually is in the underworld. Nothing. It is noise from above. It is the vibration of someone else's voice on the surface of a world you can no longer touch or smell or taste or feel. It does not warm you. It does not restore your mind. It does not give you back a single one of the 33 years you traded for it. In the gray light of the Asphodel Meadow, the king and the beggar cast identical shadows. Or rather, neither of them casts a shadow at all, because both of them are shadows, thin and weightless, and stripped of the cognitive apparatus that would allow them to understand the difference between their former stations. Book 24 of the Odyssey delivers the final image, the one Homer places at the end of the great poem like a period at the end of the cosmos. Hermes leads the souls of the slain suitors down into the underworld, and Homer, stripping away every last remnant of human dignity from these men who were kings and princes and lords of great estates, describes the sound they make. He uses the Greek verb tritzo, to squeak, to gibber, to chirp, like bats in the secret crannies of a cave, clinging together in the dark, squeaking dismally as they follow the guide downward. The booming voices that once commanded servants and debated terms and threatened violence are now high-pitched, unintelligible insect sounds. The men who sat in the great hall and demanded wine and made the lives of others miserable with their consumption and their entitlement are now indistinguishable from each other, making the same thin noise, following the same guide, in the same direction. Forever. The God who administers this outcome did not plan it as a commentary on human pretension. He planned nothing. That is the final terror. He receives, he files, he retains. The moral lesson that the condition produces is incidental to the mechanism. The mechanism does not care what lesson you take from it. It does not care if you were a good person or a terrible one, whether you spent your years in heroic pursuit of glory or in cowardly pursuit of comfort, whether you died young with your name on 10,000 lips or old with no one left to remember you. The gate opens inward, the river moves in one direction, and the god of the mists and the dense darkness, who drew his lot fairly from the cosmic container, continues to administer his jurisdiction with the same flawless, emotionless consistency he has maintained since before the world had a name for what he was. He does not need to be feared for what he might do to you. He needs to be understood for what he will inevitably do to everything. Every monument, every empire, every name, every song. Every Kleos ever generated by every hero who ever chose the short, bright life over the long, gray one. He will receive all of it. He will file all of it. And none of it will mean anything to him, because meaning is a property of the living, and the living, eventually, run out. This is not a warning. Warnings imply the possibility of avoidance. This is a description of the operating system you were born inside. And the ancient Greeks, who looked at it more honestly than almost any civilization before or since, named it, fled its name, poured blood into its pits, beat the ground with their bare fists, chased glory across burning plains, built entire philosophical systems to make it bearable, and still, in their most honest moments. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, in the word thritzo, in Achilles' wish to be a living slave, admitted what they actually knew. The machine without pity is the only machine that never breaks down. And here is the irony that only becomes visible once you have seen the whole shape of it. Hades is the only god the Greeks refused to worship from love. The only god whose temple practice was built entirely around not attracting his attention. The only deity whose name was systematically replaced by flattery and euphemism and desperate linguistic engineering. He was the most avoided, the most feared, the most distant from human affection of any figure in the entire Greek cosmos. And he is also the only one whose essential reality has never, not once, been disproven. The Olympians faded, their temples became rubble, their priests became archaeologists, their worship became scholarship. The Christian God who replaced them in the Mediterranean imagination has been accepted and rejected and revised across 16 centuries of argument. The philosophical systems built to make death bearable, Epicurus promising it felt like nothing, Plato arguing the soul escaped upward into light, have remained unverified and will remain so. But the cold, gray, patient, impersonal reality that Hades represents has not been revised by a single subsequent discovery. The mechanism of biological dissolution has not been upgraded. The river of forgetting still runs. The voices still thin down, eventually, to something that sounds less like a human being and more like the small, insistent chirp of a creature in the dark. You have been living in his jurisdiction since the day you were born, and everything you have built, every name you have made, Every song you have sung loud enough to believe it might outlast you is already part of the ledger. Not the final entry. Not yet. But the gate fastener is patient. He is the only god who has never once had to hurry. Think about the last time you worked on something you hoped would outlast you. A piece of writing, a building, a child's memory of who you were. Think about the specific quality of that hope, the way it felt like a proof against the dark. Now ask yourself, were you building something that defied the machine? Or were you simply doing what every hero at Troy was doing, running as fast and as brightly as you could in the one direction that felt like resistance, even knowing that the gate only opens inward? If you chose the way of Achilles, the short life burned at full intensity for the sake of what you leave behind, was that a greater form of courage, or a more sophisticated form of denial? And if you chose the way the suitors died, absorbed into the gray without distinction, without having burned or chosen or shouted your name into the available air, which of those two endings does the god of the mists and the dense darkness prefer? He doesn't. That's the answer. He doesn't prefer either. He receives both. And the fact that you are still here trying to answer that question, still running your calculation, still reaching for whatever version of Kleos your particular century makes available to you, is the only evidence you need that the machine is working exactly as designed. There is one thread in this story that was never resolved. One figure who appears at the edge of the myth and does not receive a proper ending. The god Thanatos, death personified, whom Sisyphus actually managed to chain, who was removed from the cosmos entirely for long enough that the living could not die, who was eventually unchained and returned to his function. What happens to him after that? What is it like to be the embodiment of the inevitable? To be briefly captured, briefly made to understand what it feels like to be contained, and then returned to a function you cannot refuse? That story has been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and you are already further into it than you realize.